Today we will be examining the following question. What problems does Japanese present its students with, grammatically speaking, that other languages don't present their students with? What is difficult grammatically about Japanese specifically? Anybody who's thinking of studying Japanese, or anybody who's already studying Japanese, will know that its grammar can be brutally difficult to understand. I'm not going to say that it's more complex than the grammar of any other language, but it's certainly very, very alien if your native language is a European language. But why exactly? What's so hard about it? I speak Russian quite well. I probably speak Russian better than I speak Japanese these days. Russian also has a reputation for being grammatically quite complex and quite nasty. But its complexity isn't the same type of complexity as the complexity of Japanese. And it's worth pointing out that any foreign language that you study is going to create problems for you grammatically. I speak Spanish reasonably well, and Spanish isn't the most difficult language grammatically for English speakers to learn, but there are things about it that are really hard. There are things in the grammar of Spanish that are difficult to understand and very, very difficult to use properly in real time. All languages are going to create problems grammatically. In addition to that, whenever you learn any foreign language, there will be thousands, maybe tens of thousands of fiddly, awkward little things that just don't work the way they do in your language. Individually, they're not particularly big problems, but when you take them all and add them together, they create a lot of grammatical difficulty and complexity. However, those myriad little differences are not the things that I want to focus on today. What I want to focus on today is the question of what exactly are the big things in Japanese that make it so hard to learn grammatically? What are the things that are so commonly encountered throughout the language, virtually any time you try and make a sentence, that will create massive stumbling blocks to being able to put sentences together? Think about it like this. You probably know that Japanese has counters. In Japanese, if you want to say, I bought one book or two books or three books, there's going to be a counter. The counter attaches to the number. 本を1冊買いました。本を2冊買いました。本を3冊買いました。The counter is the satsu, right? It's used for books, it's used for magazines, it's used for things like that. What happens if you say 本を1つ買いました? It's not the best way of saying it, but it's not a big problem. So that sort of problem isn't the type of thing that I want to focus on today, right? In English, you can use the word when in lots of different ways. You can use it as a question word. Hey, when did you get here? Or you can use it as a sort of conjunction for making clear which point in time you're referring to. When I went to Japan last year, I had a really good time. That sort of when is another way that we can use the word when in English, right? Now the word for when in Japanese, if by when you mean the question word when, is itsu. If you try and make this sort of sentence I just mentioned, when I went to Japan last year, using the question word for when in Japanese, you're going to end up with complete and utter gibberish and no one's going to understand what you're talking about. That's a major conceptual problem. If you want to say when I went to Japan last year, you have to say 去年日本に行った時に. So I don't want to look at the wrinkles today. I want to look at the major conceptual problems and cognitive problems that you're going to encounter when you try and put sentences together in Japanese. By way of a disclaimer, I know that virtually everything I say about Japanese today is also going to be true of Korean. I've never really studied Korean, but I know a little bit about it. I know that it has a very similar grammar. So yes, if you're familiar with Korean, if you're studying Korean, then you'll be in a position to say, this isn't so strange, Japanese isn't so weird, I get that. But most people will not study all of these languages. God help us all, we can't study every language, can we? So, unless you're also studying Korean, the things I'm going to talk about today they won't necessarily be unique to Japanese, but they will present you with a degree of complexity that makes Japanese a problem in a way that other languages will not be a problem for you. Today we're going to look at three things in total. The three things we're going to look at are wa and ga, Japanese morphology, and Japanese sentence structure. Wa and ga are indeed the problem from hell. Or maybe I should say a problem from hell, because arguably there's more than one in Japanese, but they really are as difficult as they are made out to be. My understanding of wa and ga is not complete. I don't know that your understanding of these things ever can be complete if you start learning Japanese basically as an adult. But nonetheless, my Japanese is fairly good in this regard. Maybe sometimes I use wa where a Japanese person would use ga or vice versa, but only in situations where it doesn't make that much difference which one you use. And there are situations where it doesn't make that much difference. In my experience of teaching teaching Japanese, the main problem with wa and ga is not that people use wa where they should use ga or vice versa. The main problem is that they use them both at random. It takes a long time to develop any real understanding of what you're supposed to do with them at all, and people do have a tendency just to whack them into sentences pretty much arbitrarily. Students who are still beginners or even up to lower intermediate, in fact, to some extent, they tend to develop a sense when they're trying to say things in Japanese that they should use some particle somewhere, so they pick either wa or ga and just kind of shove it in. It's normally wa, but sometimes it's ga. So imagine you live in Japan, you go into the station to get a train to go into Tokyo, and you bump into a Japanese friend and they say to you, doko ikuno? The person who hasn't managed to figure out what you're supposed to do with wa or ga might say something like this: Watashi ga Tokyo wa ikimasu, which is terrible Japanese and basically gibberish. If you have the words watashi, Tokyo, and ikimasu, then they will figure out what you mean, but that doesn't mean that it's correct as Japanese. Or you'll be at a party, for example, and someone will say to you, itsu kairu no? When are you going to go home? And people will say things like, ima ga kairimasu, which is also terrible. People just don't know where you have to use particles and where you don't have to use them, and they don't know which ones to use anyway. There's a lot of random particle insertion that happens in Japanese in the early stages. So if you make mistakes with the other particles, if somebody asks you where you live and you want to say Nihon ni sundemasu, if you end up saying Nihon de sundemasu, that is a mistake, but it's not too bad because it's obvious what that means, right? People will understand what it means. There's enough redundancy in that sentence. But with wa and ga, it doesn't normally work like that. The roles they play grammatically in Japanese are different and much more, in a sense, fundamental than that sort of stuff. I know 4 languages pretty well, and I'm still working on my Chinese, and I can honestly say there's only one semantic stroke grammatical problem that is more of a problem from hell than Japanese wa and ga, and that is the difference between the, and using no article at all in English from the perspective of people whose native languages don't have articles. That is the very definition of a problem from hell, I promise you. So be glad you're not learning English. Next to that, it's wa and ga in Japanese. The second thing that makes Japanese so hard grammatically is its morphology. Morphology is just a fancy word to talk about the different forms that words can take on. We think of verb conjugations, you get noun declensions and things like that in Russian and lots of other languages, in fact. Nouns don't really do anything in Japanese. If you think of English, we get I, me, when you're talking about pronouns, he, him, she, her. In Japanese, of course, you don't even have that. You use particles instead. The morphological complexity is basically in the system of verbs in Japanese, and it can be a nightmare. There are basically 2 types of problems that people tend to have when they know a bit of Japanese morphology. Problem number 1 is that they get stuck in the middle of words. So sometimes people will try and use a causative passive like tabesaserareru, and they just get stuck and they can't remember how to get through it. So they'll say tabesare, tabesasera, tabesasera, and then they just start making things up that don't exist in the language at all. That's a problem, because however simple it may be to say tabesaserareru when you are studying by yourself, as soon as you're confronted with another human being, you discover that it's really hard to say this kind of stuff in real time. That's problem number 1. The second problem is that people get to the end of some sort of conjugation, let's call them conjugations for lack of a better word, but what happens in the middle is a load of garbage. So you say to someone, okay, we have the I adjective, omoshiroi. What's the negative form? And they say, omoshiranai, omoshanai, Omoshakanai. They have no idea what's going on in the middle of it. But somehow they get to the end. The end may not be correct, but they get to some sort of end. If you say to someone, okay, how do you say something wasn't interesting? It should be omoshiroku nakatta, omoshikanakatta. All sorts of nonsense, and people have no idea what's going on in the middle of the word. In virtually every other language that I know about, There are exceptions, of course, but in most of the languages, words are not as long. This agglutinative grammar that Japanese has, where verbs get longer and longer and longer as you do more and more things to them. Most languages don't work like that, at least most of the languages that Westerners are likely to study. So let's take the following English sentence. If you hadn't kept it under the sink, it wouldn't have got wet. Now what happens if I say it like this? If you not kept it on the sink, it not got wet. Now there were probably at least 5 or 6 grammatical errors in that sentence. But if you concentrate and you listen to people and you have a context, then you should be able to understand it. And the speaker can somehow hammer their way through that sentence even if they don't know how to say it correctly. The problem with Japanese is that morphology stops people from even hammering their way badly through a sentence like that. Why? Because they say things. They either get hung up, like I said in the first example, they either get hung up with things like tabesaserareru, or they'll say omoshanai instead of omoshirokunai, and people will not understand that. So there's something about this agglutinative grammar Japanese has that makes it very hard to get through a sentence at all often. People just grind to a halt and they discover that they have no idea how to keep going. The third problem in Japanese is the astonishingly alien, topsy-turvy, subjectively speaking, nature of Japanese sentence structure and word order. If you've watched the Berserk anime or if you've read the manga, you'll remember that there's a bit where Guts comes back and helps rescue the Band of the Hawk when they are being hunted. They've been expelled from Midland, is it called? I can't remember. Griffith has been taken prisoner and they've been on the run for a year. When they have escaped, the people pursuing them with Guts' help, there's a sort of confrontation between Guts and Kyaska. And Kyaska says to Guts, and I haven't looked it up, but this is my memory of it, "Omae ni dake tasukeraretaku nakatta n da yo." Now what that means is, I didn't want to be saved by you of all people. You of all people, because Guts had left them, remember. And she sees it obviously as being a humiliation to be rescued by the guy who deserted them in a sense. Now the dake in this sentence is a bit awkward. It doesn't mean only or just. That's why I said, by you of all people. Dake is a slippery word in Japanese. You can't always translate it as being only. That said, look at the sheer alienness of this sentence. You start with the word you, omae. Omae ni dake. You by of all people, as I'm translating it here, and then you have this long, complex, you see a good example of this agglutinative grammar. Tasukeraretaku nakatta n da yo. So it's tasukeraretaku nakatta, and then you have that n da yo at the end, right? So you can see that this is growing to a significant extent out of the second point that I made a moment ago about Japanese morphology. To speak Japanese, you have to know immediately that this form, tasukeraretaku nakatta, is the form you need. You don't have much time to think about it. You have to know that you start with the verb that means to save. The first thing you do is take that, tasukeru, and you have to turn it into its passive form, tasukerareru. Then you have to turn that into the want to form, tasukeraretai. Then you have to make that negative, tasukeraretaku nai. Then you have to put that into the past, tasukeraretaku nakatta. And then you have the ndayo, which is something we don't need to talk about too much, but it's the nominalizing or no originally, then the copula, then an emphatic particle. So we're going verb that means to help, then passive marker, then want, then the negator, and then the bit that puts it into the past tense. And your brain has to be able to create these things and know which form to use, bang, like that, where you've got no chance in Japanese in the long term. Of course it takes time to learn this. No one expects you to be able to do this stuff in the beginning, but this is what you have to be moving towards. So the various units of meaning here are radically scrambled with respect to the way that they would exist in English, and many of them are stuck together in this very long word, tasukeraretaku nakatta, and that can only be made in one order. All these operations you perform on that word to turn into that form have to be performed in a certain order. There's no flexibility, right? You can't take the verb tasukeru and decide to put it into the past first, because if you do that, you get tasuketa, and you've just finished. There's nothing else you can do with it there. You can't keep going. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks very much for listening. See you next time. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.